Okay, so what we're doing today is we're just looking at the introduction to psychology. So we're only covering one spread today, and this spread is pretty straightforward. So we've done our brainstorm about what psychology is. We've identified a few different key terms related to psychology. So now what we're looking at is its definition. Okay, psychology is a scientific study. It falls in the VCE sciences. And I know different people, depending on your cultural background, depending on your age, okay, some people don't believe psychology is a science. Some people think it's more of a social thing, but we know that in psychology, we do study human thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. There's a big focus on how the brain influences these three processes. And for that reason, we do acknowledge that psychology is a science. We also acknowledge that it's a science because of its use of the experimental method or the scientific method, which involves not just making claims, but, experimenting, collecting results. And those results often either support or don't support a given hypothesis, okay? So that's why we do acknowledge psychology as a science rather than a pseudoscience. And we're going to look at what pseudoscience means in just a bit. Before we do that, we need to understand that psychology is about the relationship between thoughts, feelings, and behavior, right? So thoughts and feelings are also known as mental processes, okay? They're known as mental processes because they are based in the brain, or they stem from the brain and its activity. Behavior, on the other hand, is actual observable behavior. It's more physical. It's an action, okay? And you can directly observe someone doing that behavior. Thoughts and feelings, on the other hand, cannot be directly observed, okay? Because even though you might be next to someone, you might think that you know that person really well, you can't ever really know what someone is thinking or feeling at any given moment, okay? And so for that reason, we say thoughts and feelings are a little harder for us to observe directly, okay? Now, sometimes a person's behavior can give us an inkling as to what they are feeling. For example, if someone is doing a test and they're kind of, they've got sweat pouring down their face, we might kind of use that as, we might make a guess that, okay, this person should be really nervous, or maybe they're doing a really difficult question, okay? If someone is clenching their fist, that's kind of a typical sign that someone's angry or that someone's not feeling a very positive emotion there, okay? So that's the basic idea. Sometimes we can make guesses as to how someone is feeling based on their behavior, but it could be really difficult. For example, someone might clench their fist because that's just a habit of theirs, okay? They're not really angry, but it's just something they do when they get nervous or when they, when they're standing, okay? So again, it's not always reliable, okay? So that's the basic idea. So you need to know the relationship between thoughts, feelings, and how they influence your behavior, okay? In other words, for example, if I think that I'm not good at, let's say, maths, let's say I don't like maths, I don't think I'm good at it, I don't like maths, or if I say I hate maths, hate is the feeling, okay? And then when you say you hate maths, that obviously makes you think, give me an example of a thought that I would think in my brain about maths if I hated maths. Put it in the chat box. Something that I would think about maths, just a thought that I'd have in my head about maths if I was to hate maths or have a very negative feeling towards maths. Yeah, I feel less motivated to do it. Yeah, so you might tell yourself, okay, I don't feel motivated to do it. I can't be bothered. Those are all thoughts, okay? So you might tell yourself, I can't do it. Okay, I can't do it. Okay, even without trying, even before you give it a go, you tell yourself, I can't do it. And then the behavior is, when your behavior is negative and you're telling yourself, I can't do it, you're obviously not going to do it. You're not going to try. Okay, that's how thoughts, feelings, and behavior influence one another. Okay, and it's not always in that order. Sometimes your feelings can influence your thoughts. Sometimes your thoughts influence your feelings. There's no specific order there, but that's the basic idea. Yeah. So you can just maybe doze off at your table. You might just give up. You might not actually do the behavior there. Okay, so this is a really common question to, describe with reference to an example, how thoughts, feelings, and behavior are related. And this is really kind of pretty straightforward as long as you understand how thoughts, feelings, and behavior can influence one another. Okay, so moving on. Yeah, I've already talked about this in the previous slide, but yeah, just basically understanding this idea that thoughts, feelings, and behavior are not separate processes. They are actually interconnected and they're interrelated. Okay, so for example, if you think that you've not studied enough for an exam, even though you have studied, thinking that you haven't studied enough, or thinking that, oh my God, like I'm so unprepared, that might make you feel nervous. That might make you feel upset. That might make you feel anxious before or during the exam. And that might then lead to behavior such as increased sweating, you not being able to attempt exam questions, you dropping your pens all over the floor because you feel like so agitated. Okay, so all of those thoughts and feelings can influence that kind of consequent behavior there. Okay, I want you guys now to give me one example in the chat box about your own example. So could be about you, could be about someone you know, just a general example of how for one person, their thoughts and feelings might influence their behavior. It can be a positive example in a positive thought and feeling, or it could be a negative example, whatever. So I want everyone to try their best now to give me a general example. Now, could be Katie feels this and this causes her to think like that and this causes her to behave. So just any example there. Okay, I'll give you guys about 1 minute now to write an example in the chat box. And as long as it makes sense, there's honestly no right and wrong. As long as it flows and it's logical, it'll be fine. So just give me your best example now in the chat box. Come on, guys, quick, quick, quick. Okay, we got one example. Yep, if someone is afraid to meet new people, they might feel anxious or scared to speak and sit in the corner of the room instead of talking to many people. Good. When under pressure, you might start shaking a lot and the room around you might begin to feel hot. This usually makes the performance go down. Yep, that's good. Okay, those are good examples. So yeah, all you're doing, guys, is your Katie has not completed her homework, which makes her feel anxious and stressed when the teacher asks for it. Yeah. So that's, yeah, and she might even think that she is not good enough in the subject, or she might not, she might think that she's not organized enough. Yeah, if someone is afraid around people, they'd normally try to separate themselves from large groups. Yeah, that's good. Good examples there. As long as it's logical and as long as it's consistent, yeah, that's fine. That's totally fine. And look, it's really important, guys, for us to understand the relationship between thoughts, feelings, and behavior, because if we don't understand people. This is what leads to a lot of misunderstandings. If you don't know that your friend has been feeling upset lately, when they lash out or they scream at you or they don't return your calls, you won't understand the negative state of mind that they were in that caused them to act that way. Okay, so a lot of kind of like our relationships with people, our friendships with people really rests on our ability to understand how they're feeling, because we know that feelings influence thoughts and behavior. Okay, and vice versa. Cool. So let's move on to the next slide. Okay, now looking at the scientific nature of psychology. I just already talked about this at the beginning, but psychology is classified as one of the sciences, and all the sciences, chemistry, psychology, biology, they all share this common thread, and physics, sorry, they all share this common thread of using or applying this scientific method. The scientific method is basically this step-by-step process that involves collecting data, selecting a sample, running an experiment, collecting the results. It's all the different steps that you would normally include, like introduction, method, discussion, all those things. Okay, so basically when we do any topic in psychology, that topic has been studied extensively. For example, when we start looking at the brain, people didn't know from the beginning of time that the brain had two hemispheres. Okay, they didn't know that the frontal lobe was responsible for personality and movement. They didn't know these things, but through experimentation, through extensive research that was backed up by evidence, they were able to find out these things. Nothing in psychology that we study is actually made up. It's always got some kind of scientific background or scientific evidence there to support it. Okay, so there's a picture of a graph here. A lot of the time when we do experiments in psychology, we often collect data, and that data can then be converted into a graph, which is again a form of scientific data representation there. Okay, later on this term, when we do our research poster, which is similar to the ones we do in year 11 and 12, you'll get a better understanding of how all of these concepts come together. Okay, This is a really kind of general example, not the best, but just to give you guys a kind of good introduction into what scientific nature of psychology is like. Like we all know the saying that you can't judge a book by its cover. Okay, we all know what that means. We've heard it probably millions of times in our life. But basically what that means, a psychologist might be interested in planning an experiment related to that concept of you can't judge a book by its cover. So what they first need to do is they first need to select a number of participants from the population, okay? They might choose to use, for example, a number of first-year students from a local university, okay? Then those participants would need to sign a consent form after being given the information about what the study is going to be like, okay? Then they might go through a specific procedure or task. Example, the experimenter might set up the same person or similar looking people. For example, in this scenario, both of these men look to be of similar build. Okay, they both don't have hair, so that could be a factor there. Okay, and you might put that same person or similar looking person in different scenarios. So in one scenario, the person's wearing like a suit, looking pretty smart, and in the second scenario, the person has tattoos all over them or something like that, something that makes them look less professional, or as society would define that. So then basically you would get the participants to rate what the personality of the person is like, okay, out of 10. And so that would be an example of an experiment, and that would allow us to get some results. And from those results, we can then put that onto a graph. Okay, we can display those results on a graph, and then we can analyze and conclude something. So if, for example, a lot of people rated this guy highly and said, okay, this guy is likely to be quite friendly, this guy is likely to be helpful if someone needs help. If a woman faints in the middle of the shopping center, he's likely to help her. Okay, if we're associating a lot of positive traits with the guy who is dressed up a lot more professionally and is presentable, and a lot more negative traits like, rude, or kind of like, what else could we say? Thinking of negative traits, maybe inconsiderate, maybe selfish. Okay, if we associate a lot of negative traits with this guy who is not presented as well as the first picture, that might then lead to our hypothesis, to our hypothesis not being supported there. Okay, if our hypothesis was that all people judge people the same regardless of how they're dressed, okay, that would not be supported. So again, our results will determine whether a hypothesis is supported or not. Okay, yeah, obnoxious is another good one. So I feel bad because I actually think the guy in the second photo looks friendlier than the guy in the first, but again, yeah, personality is subjective, okay, and the halo effect and all those things, the way we see people isn't always dependent on how they're dressed, but for majority of people, we find that that's the case. Okay, so that's the scientific nature of psychology, just showing you guys a really simple example and how we can judge the scientific nature of psychology from that. Okay, so moving on. Now we're looking at pseudoscience. So psychology for a very long time, and even today, some people don't take psychology seriously. Look, I'm not offended by it, to be honest, but it's just something that comes as a part of your culture. I know in different parts of the world, psychology is still not studied as a science. It's still seen as kind of like general knowledge or common sense or one of those other ridiculous things. But, in VCE psychology in Australia, in most Western countries, we do acknowledge its scientific properties. We do acknowledge that psychology is not a pseudoscience. So what is a pseudoscience? Pseudoscience basically means something that looks like it's scientific on the outset or on the outside, but it's actually false. It's not backed by any scientific claims or any scientific evidence, okay? Astrology, okay, which is basically your horoscopes, like, oh, I'm an Aquarius. I don't even know what I am. Yeah, I'm an Aquarius. I make people run away from me easily. Or I don't know. I don't even know about these traits, to be honest. But you know how people say, I'm a Libra, I make friends easily, I'm a this, I'm a that, whatever. Okay, so that's horoscopes. That's related to astrology. People think that the movement of stars and planets influences how quick they'll get married or how successful they'll be at work or school. Okay, which is not true because, we don't really believe in that. There are people who believe in that, but there's no evidence to suggest that astrology is a thing. In the same way that there's no evidence to suggest that numerology is a thing. Okay, some people believe in this thing like a lucky number. Okay, they'd want their baby to be born on the 8th of November, even though the baby's not due until maybe the 14th of November, because 8 is probably their lucky number, okay? If they come across something like they buy a new car and the number plate that they get is, 726 or something like that, those are their lucky numbers, and they feel like, oh, that's a good sign for my future, but that's not true. There's no evidence in that, okay? Graphology is the same thing. A person's handwriting doesn't really tell us anything about their personality, okay? And we know this because we know people like doctors write really messy. They, half the time I can't even understand what my doctor writes on the prescription, but that doesn't make them any less intellectual. That doesn't make their personality any less favorable, okay? So that's what graphology is. And palmistry is about the lines on a person's palm. Some people think that the longer your, lifeline is, the longer that you'll live. So again, there are other factors that influence your life, like, your health, your genetics, all that stuff plays a role. Those are evidence-based. Palmistry is not evidence-based. Okay, so because none of these above approaches are based on scientific facts or evidence, we call them pseudoscience. They're still fascinating to a lot of people. It doesn't mean we have to completely go against people who believe in these things, but, they're not really based in evidence or science. And so we don't study any of these in any depth in psychology either. Okay, so that's the basic idea. Okay. Now, just before we finish off for today, just going to look at some basic ideas behind the brain and the hemispheres. We're not going into the lobes of the brain today because that's a big topic, but we really need to understand that the brain is a big part of psychology. And I know every year students are like, oh my God, Miss, why do we have to study so much about the brain? Well, without the brain, there is no psychology, okay? So the brain is important. It's at the center. It's the master organ with which we think, feel, and behave. So without the brain, there is no psychology, okay? And, I love my brain. I mean, I love my little cartoon brains that I put everywhere. So we need to have the brain. We always need to have that, okay? It's not just the brain, it's the nervous systems as well. We'll learn about these a little later in the term, okay? But for now, we will look at the brain, okay? And the brain is a topic along with the nervous systems that we cover in Unit 1, cover in Unit 2, cover in Unit 3, and Unit 4, okay? In some form or the other, okay? So we do need to understand it quite well. Okay, so let's have a look at some key features of the brain. When we're looking at the brain, we're looking at basically a few different characteristics. We're looking at the idea that the brain is generally about 1.5 kilos in terms of weight. In terms of texture, it feels like firm jelly, okay, and it contains many folds. If you're going to do Unit 1 and 2 psych, we often do a brain dissection, okay? Not of a human brain, obviously, that's unethical, but of a sheep brain, which is very similar in terms of its characteristics and texture and size, okay? The brain is also, the two hemispheres of the brain are also connected by a band of nerve tissue, and that band of nerve tissue, I don't know if you can see it really clearly in the image here, is actually called the corpus callosum, okay? It's just a bundle of nerve fibers that basically connect the two hemispheres of the brain. And just like any type of fibers, the corpus callosum can be cut, okay? And in people who have gone through something called split brain surgery, which you'll learn about in Unit 1, the corpus callosum is actually cut, okay? So this is actually just cut right down the middle, and that basically causes the two hemispheres to no longer be connected to one another, okay? So that bridge or that bundle of nerve fibers that connects the two hemispheres is called the corpus callosum. The brain consists of two types of matter, gray matter, which is basically your cell bodies, which are called gray matter because they look gray in color. Okay, we can see them on the top of the brain here on the surface, kind of grayish color, and the white matter is our axons. Okay, the axons, you might have heard of this before where if you've studied neurons in biology or in Year 9 science, axons are basically the part of the neuron that relays the message or that sends the message. The brain is divided into two hemispheres, the left and the right brain hemisphere, which we'll look at in a little bit more depth. And the outer layer of the brain, which is basically the layer of the brain that you can see, okay, from the outside without having to poke in and dissect it, that is called the cerebral cortex. On the surface of the cerebral cortex, you've got the 4 lobes of the brain. Okay, you've got one in the front, that's your frontal lobe. The top side is called the parietal. The back is called the occipital and the side is called the temporal. We're going to learn more about these 4 lobes next week, okay? And yeah, those are some characteristics of the brain. Often this information will often ask you in multiple choice questions, sometimes in short answer as well, but generally comes up a lot in multiple choice. Okay, just let me know if you guys are having any confusions as well about this, any of the topics we're going through so far. Okay, so with hemispheric specialization, we know that there are two hemispheres of the brain. I think even people who don't do psychology know this. It's kind of general knowledge. We've got a left brain hemisphere and a right brain hemisphere. What hemispheric specialization means? What does it mean, guys, to be specialized in something? Let's unpack that term. In the chat box, just write down, what do you think it means to be specialized in something? Yeah, it means that you're the best at it or you're better at it than someone else. Okay, if I'm specialized in psychology, it means that I'm probably better at psychology than a teacher who's only specialized in physics. Okay, they're better at physics than I am, for example. They're more specialized in that. So better, or basically having better control of that. Okay, so when we're talking about the specialization of the brain hemispheres, we're basically talking about this idea that the left brain hemisphere has specific functions for which it's specialized, for which it has more control compared to the right brain hemisphere, and vice versa. So the right brain hemisphere also has specific functions for which it is more specialized compared to the left hemisphere. That's the basic idea, and that's the definition here. Okay, it refers to this idea that the left and brain hemispheres have specialized functions, or that they show greater control over particular functions. In general, what we say is that the left brain hemisphere plays a role in language-based functions. Okay, so you can remember alpha left, alpha language. So reading, writing, speaking, all of these things are controlled or specializations of the left brain hemisphere. Okay, speech, language, comprehension, and this is written, verbal, spoken, written or verbal, they all apply there. Okay, the right brain hemisphere is more involved in, another word for language-based functions is verbal functions. Okay, the right hemisphere though is controls your non-verbal functions. Okay, non-verbal. So we're talking about functions that don't require reading, writing, or speaking, functions that are more, I would say, creative in nature. So when we're talking about things like, for example, appreciating art, appreciating music, spatial ability, so your ability to navigate using a map, all of those things are non-verbal functions. They're not really things that you can learn from a book, in other words. Okay, a lot of the functions you can't learn from a book. You can't just read about. They just have to occur naturally, or they just have to involve you doing something. Those are nonverbal functions. Painting a picture, for example. You can't learn how to paint a picture from a book. It's something you have to actually get into, get your paintbrush out, start painting. It's something you have to do. So for that reason, it's a nonverbal function. Okay, look, I think that there is this idea that some people say that they're more right brain than left brain. For example, if you love art and you love music and you love you know, you enjoy those things more so than, let's say, writing essays in English, or more so than doing maths questions. You know, some people might say, oh, I'm more right brain, I'm more left brain. There used to be this this kind of belief that people could be more left brain than right brain, but as of today, people don't believe that anymore. Right now, what we say is that essentially everyone uses both sides of their brain almost equally, the left and the right hemisphere, but we don't realize it as much. Even when you're appreciating art and music, for example, often we might be focusing on the lyrics of a song, or we might be focusing on the analysis of an art or a painting or sculpture that we're looking at. And when we're analyzing something, we are actually using our left brain hemisphere. And a lot of the time, we're never just using either this or this, but we're using both of them together. Okay, and we don't realize it. It often happens at a subconscious level where we don't even realize we're using both of those brain hemispheres. Okay, also functions that are common to both are sensation and movement. Okay, and we're going to learn more about this when we do the lobes of the brain, but basically motor function and sensory function occur on opposite sides of the body. Okay, opposite side of the body corresponds to the opposite side of the brain. Okay, that's called contralateral functioning. We'll go through that in a bit more depth next week. Basically means, guys, if I want to pick up my water bottle with my right hand, it's my left brain hemisphere that's going to control that. Okay, if someone pours hot water on my, let's say on my left foot, okay, they just pull, I don't know for what reason or the other, they're just pouring hot water on my left foot, that is going to be felt, or that information will be processed by my right brain hemisphere. So whatever body part it is, left or right, just choose the opposite side of the brain, and that's the side of the brain that will control that particular function there. Alrighty, just before we go, this just again, this is just one more thing I need to explain or need to include. In terms of the functions that you need to know, just learn around 3 to 4 functions for each of the left and the right brain hemisphere. So movement and sensation you can automatically include as 2 separate functions. Okay, so that essentially all you need to do is learn an extra 2 functions for each one, which shouldn't be too hard. And remember, hemispheric specialization is actually quite a straightforward concept. It's just a matter of you just learning them. So you can learn any ones. We're never going to ask you about a specific one, but you've got a choice. So look, you've only got to learn any 4 from the left brain hemisphere, any 4 from the right brain. So look how much you have. You have so many. You just have to choose any 4. Okay. And if any of those don't make sense, you can just let me know. Just learn the ones that make the most sense to you, because you're more likely to remember them rather than trying to learn one that's confusing. Okay, I think that, that finishes us up for spread A. All right, guys, so just before we go, I'm just going to stop the recording first.